For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Okay, looks like we are live, and I gotta say, guys, we have an awesome show for everybody today. I am extremely excited, and we've already got a good, lively audience. So here we go. Let's get this party started. It is a blessing to have Joseph Hubbard on here today to discuss topics pertaining to fossils, zoology, paleobiology, paleontology, and more. So we're going to be touching on some awesome topics. It's truly a blessing to have Joseph here with us today, and I want to thank him for giving us his time for this very important show. I also want to thank George for being here, for helping with this presentation, interview, and question and answer. So before I hand it over to George, though, I know everybody in the chat is as excited as me. We're going to be starting off with a presentation from Joe, followed by a question and answer on the related topic. So please tag me with your questions at Standing for Truth. That way I won't miss it, and we'll make sure we have a good Q&A. So anyways, enough for me. I'm going to hand it over to you, Brother George. Thank you again for joining me for this presentation and interview. Would you do the honors of introducing our guest to the audience today, George? And George, you're on mute. Oh, there you go. You're good to go.
No problem. It's an honor, actually. First of all, I'd like to thank Joe and praise and really fine living, because we only had like over 12 hours to prepare for this. So it's only due to the fact that we've lost some emails somewhere down the track. But anyway, we're finally here. So Happy New Year, Joseph. I always like to start with a little humor. Now, Joseph, what happened to the man who shoplifted a calendar on New Year's Eve?
I'm not entirely sure. I think you'll have to tell me.
He got 12 months.
Oh, of course.
All right. I have to say, Joseph, I'm thrilled to have you here today for this interesting and important presentation. I met up and spoke with John McKay a few weeks ago, and I touted the prospect of having you here on our channel. And after a number of emails, some of which, as I mentioned, were lost. But anyway, we're finally here. Yeah. I love the work you do, mate. I'll give the audience a brief introduction. You're a very credentialed person. Joseph, for those that are not aware, has been collecting fossils since the age of 6. I'll let him expand on that a bit later. A passion which he has continued throughout his life. He has completed degrees, now get a load of some of this, in geology, specializing in paleobiology and zoology, and has completed specialist courses and diplomas in genetics, dinosaurian paleontology, biblical archaeology, British archaeology, and mycology. In other words, this is one highly qualified man. Individuals like Joe are the reason why evolution and uniformitarianism have been so completely overturned. You just don't find people like Joe with such well-rounded knowledge in the fields of paleobiology, archaeology, naturalist creation research, animal. It just keeps going on. And of course, he's a book enthusiast. Now, for those that may not know what paleobiology is, and I have to admit I didn't, and I had to look it up. It's a growing, comparatively new discipline which combines the methods and findings of the life science, that is biology, with the methods and findings of the earth science, paleontology. Now, he has over 13 years experience in the field of paleontology and nature work, and 4 years experience in the animal care industry. His studies in zoology led him to work in the animal care industry as a zookeeper for 6 years, before joining creation research full-time as a UK director in 2019. I could never do that, Joe. I couldn't handle a snake. I'm dead set scared of snakes.
So am I.
Now,
keep them away from me.
Now, Joseph's undertaken numerous research, has given talks and presentations, and he's led field trips, some of which I've actually seen. His research finds are often reported in creation research evidence news, and often on the creation researchers' Facebook and Instagram. From someone who is considerably older than you, that's me, Joseph, just a small piece of advice. As you begin to scale the heights in years, I will share some wisdom to prepare you, okay? I've noticed as I got older, I learned something new every day, but I forget 5 other things. and please remember, in a recent study, they found women who carry a little extra weight live longer than men who mention it.
Oh, well, yeah.
Take it from me. Don't go there, Joseph. This study is very interesting, actually. In another extensive worldwide study, they actually asked over 10,000 elderly men in 30 different countries. Now, that's a sample size of 300,000. That's, from a statistical analysis point of view, that's a very good sample size. Now, they asked these men why they think men die before women. And the most common answer was, because they want to. now that you and everyone is rolling on the floor with laughter, I wish. Enough from Stanley and I. Joseph, seriously, thank you again for joining us today and giving us your time. Please have the floor, and also please correct me on anything that we may have gotten wrong, or even said anything in terms of introduction you'd like to correct us on. So over to you, Joseph. You can roast me later if you like.
Thank you very much, George. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here so I can get up some pretty pictures for you all to have a look at. There we go. And let's just get it up nice and Big for everybody. There we are. Wonderful. Okay, so you can see creation research there. You can see John Mackay is with me there. He was on the show a little while back. You can see me. You can see our international director, John Mackay. And in between the two of us, you can see a dead head, more specifically a Neanderthal skull. And you also see our website at the bottom there, creationresearch.net, with Q&A. We've already mentioned we're going to have a Q&A session later on this evening, but if you aren't brave enough to ask a question, or if you don't think of a question that you suddenly remember in the middle of the night, you can go to creationresearch.net, click on Q&A, and we've got a whole host of questions and answers on there. And if they're not on there, then you can certainly submit one so that we can answer it for you. And we give you a little bit deeper explanation. And George did a fantastic job of sort of introducing who I am and what I do. I'm the director of Creation Research UK, and I speak all over the world at wonderful places. This was a school a little while back, which we were speaking on snakes. You can sort of see a snake in the picture that I'm using behind me there. You see, my background, my main academic background is in, as was already been mentioned, paleobiology. So we look at fossils and we try and match them up to living things. We use our knowledge of living things to actually help us interpret the past. And specifically what we're supposed to be able to do is a sort of another subdivision, which is Paleo Ecology, which is actually reconstructing ecosystems in the rocks. So you dig up your rocks, you dig up your fossils, and you're supposed to be able to work out, well, this was a marine environment because it's got marine fossils in it, or this was a tropical land environment because it's got tropical land plants on it, right? Now, as we go further forward into the presentation, you'll see that there's a bit of a problem with that as we delve into the realms of Noah's flood and fossils and so on and so forth. But the reason why I consider myself in a fairly privileged position, and the Lord has been so good to me over the years, is because, as mentioned, I worked as a zookeeper for 6 years in the animal care industry. So you get a real good hands-on experience with how the living creatures worked. And my work as a zookeeper, also, they ended up funding me to go and do an academic qualification, a diploma in zoology, specifically for zookeepers. So a nice sort of rounded, double-barreled academic background, as well as the various other sort of interesting things that I've gone off and done in the past. But the two main ones are zoology and paleobiology. We love to take people on field trips. As already mentioned, we love to take people to actually go and get hands-on evidence, get hands-on information, get hands-on research, and actually take people out to show them the truth. Plus, we do our own research sort of without the public. You can see here, I'm on the Isle of Wight here. This was a couple of years ago now. And you can see I'm excavating a dinosaur skull there, a back of a dinosaur skull. Some marvelous things that God has actually enabled us to go and find, and allowed us to find and dig up and do some research. We often take cameras around with us as we travel, and we will end up filming our research projects. This is a brand new project which we've only just finished today, so praise the Lord for that. Land of Fire and Ice, dealing with that tricky, controversial subject of climate change. You see, I recently got married a few months back, and we decided to go to Iceland for a honeymoon because it was the only sort of country you could get into at the time without all the COVID restrictions and so on and so forth. My wife thought it was a honeymoon. I ended up having a sneaky agenda to wanting to go there because I wanted to actually document the history of climate. And we had a fantastic time, both on our honeymoon and actually filming and clambering up glaciers and doing some wonderful exploring. But it gives you a very interesting perspective on climate change, and more particularly important, an important biblical view of climate change and how that fits into the world around us. So you can find out more about that project again on creationresearch.net. We also have the museums project. John Mackay has been travelling and entering Europe and the UK for the last 30 odd years. That's 30 odd years of research. That's 30 odd years of fossils in our collections, which we've recently sort of collated together. I myself have been collecting fossils from the age of 6. As we've already mentioned. So we've got a lot of fossils, not just fossils though, but also artifacts, which include things like archaeological artifacts, geological exhibits, natural history, so stuffed animals and so on and so forth, which we're currently trying to get into a museum setup, including fossils like this. This was one of our donations a few years back. Can you see big fish? Can you see little fish? Can you see how little fish is coming out of big fish's mouth? Well, let's delve into this sort of realm of geology, and specifically dealing with fossils and paleobiology, and how does this all relate in a biblical fashion. Let's start by going to one of the perhaps the most famous, or certainly one of the most famous natural history museums in the world, the Natural History Museum of London. Also one of the oldest in the world as well, designed by Sir Richard Owen to look like a cathedral. You can see it standing in all its glory there. It looks very sort of cathedral or church-like. That's because it was sort of based off of a cathedral. It was designed, Sir Richard Owen, who founded it, designed it to be a display place of God's creation, including dinosaurs, which he believed, by the way, were the monsters that God made. However, if you go into these natural history museums today, you don't see Sir Richard Owen very prominently anymore. You see Charles Darwin, and you see lots and lots of fossils. Some spectacularly preserved fossils, some absolutely marvellous fossils from all over the world. And this is what they teach you in these museums. Fossilization, that is turning a creature into a fossil, is a really slow process. You see this in museums all over the world. Fossilization, according to these museums, requires a very slow process. All right, well, let's delve in a little bit deeper then. This is on a museum plaque here, actually. It's sort of been it's taken straight from a museum plaque. We've changed it slightly to get around copyright, but this is what they teach you in these museums: how to get a fossil fish. Step 1, a fish dies and sinks to the bottom of the lake. Step 2, the fish rots and only the bones are left, and so the fish is then covered with mud. Step 3, millions of years pass and the mud turns to rock. Over time, the bone matter is completely changed into mineral matter, and the fish is now a fossil. A simple 3-step plan to actually getting a fish fossil, according to the museum. And the point is, according to the museums, fish fossils are supposed to take millions of years to actually form. Millions of years for that mud to turn to rock. All right, well, let's have a Bible verse. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to what is good. I love this Bible verse because it could so easily fit in a science textbook. This is what we are supposed to do as scientists. We have an idea, we have an observation, we formulate an opinion about it, and then we go and test it. If it holds up to the evidence, you hang on to it and you use it as a building block to get to the next step. If it doesn't hold up to the evidence, then you throw it out as no good. Of course, the best thing about this Bible verse is that it isn't in a science textbook. It is actually in the Bible. You see, it's a commandment that God has told us as Christians that we ought to be doing this, testing all things, hold fast to what is good. So let's do some testing. Let's take you to the Genesis Museum of Creation Research. That's our museum we're now setting up in Shropshire in the UK. Let's introduce you once again to our fish fossil. Now, I first found out about this fish fossil. There's been a few examples of them around the world. This particular one I found out when I was in a fossil shop down in Charmouth, a very famous shop, with this wonderful fossil on display, locked up behind cabinets. And I said, oh, this is marvellous. Can I take some photographs of it, please, so I can, use it in my presentations? And he said, yes, absolutely. And so as I travelled around and I was using this in my presentations, one of the people at the presentation, a long-time supporter, came up and said, hey, I want to try and raise the funds to buy this fossil for you if it's still available. Now, this was like 6 years down the line from when I first saw the fossil, so I had no idea whether it'd still be there, but I didn't want to discourage him. Like, yeah, absolutely, go for it. And sure enough, a couple of months later, he knocked on the door, and there was the fish fossil ready for me to have and take and put in our museum. It's a wonderful fossil. You can get some spectacular detail on it, on big fish and on little fish. And you notice what I've put there? Fossil rocks are fast rocks. You see, this is a concept that is really going to sort of, what this evening is really going to centre around, is that point that fossil rocks have to be fast rocks. There's no other way to actually get a fossil. What am I talking about? Well, when I first found this fossil and took photographs of it, when I initially began to use it in my presentations, I thought that this was a fossil of a big fish who was halfway through eating his lunch, and he'd been buried so quickly that he hadn't even had time to finish his lunch. That's what I thought. That's what's promoted in many of the creationist museums around the world that have similar exhibits like this, or in books and magazines. But test all things. Let's dig in a little bit closer. Can you see little fish? And you can see where my arrows, my red arrows, are pointing to. Can you see the little indentations of where... hang on a minute. Little fish is not in the process of being eaten. Little fish has already been eaten. You can see the indentations, the teeth marks, from where big fish has munch, gobbled him down. And then something has so suddenly and so violently caught up big fish and squashed him that little fish has gone blop, and it's come out of his mouth. This is a fish which is currently vomiting a recently eaten meal. Fast rocks? Yeah, it's been buried so quickly with such a huge amount of force that it's literally forced the contents out of its stomach. And I don't know if you can see it there. Let's see if I can get a little laser pointer on here. There we go. If I show you down here, this sort of little straight thing here, this is actually another small fish inside. That's part of the backbone. Another small fish which is already inside the creature's mouth. This isn't the only example. This is one of our big displays that we have in Australia in our big collection. You see all the fish there? You see the fish up in the top corner? Let's blow him up a little bit. Can you see big fish? Can you see little fish? Can you see little fish coming out of big fish's mouth? You see, this is exactly the same type of fossil as we have in the UK. The only difference is little fish is a little bit more digested. Hey, this is a fossil fish vomit. Something has caught this fish up so quickly and so suddenly and so violently, it's forced the contents of his stomach out into the surrounding area. Now, if you keep fish, or if you keep any sort of pets or whatever, one thing you know is that vomit doesn't hang around very long, and also neither does like fecal, feces, poo, fish poo. It disintegrates when it comes out. Vomit, when fish vomit, it just disintegrates into the disperses into the sea around it. If you want to actually get something trapped like this, you need to bury that creature, you need to bury that fish mixed into the sediment with such violence and such force that it forces the vomit out, but the vomit can't actually go anywhere. And so you end up having a fossil fish vomiting. All right, let's go back to step one of that three-step plan. Can you remember what it was according to the museums? How do you get a fossil fish? Step one, the fish dies and sinks to the bottom of the lake. Well, you've got your first problem there, because here's a dead fish. It's not sunk to the bottom in the slightest. It's floating on the top. See, this is because fossil fish, actually have something called a swim bladder, or a air bladder, or most fish do anyway. And you see, when they're swimming along and they die, this swim bladder will bloat, they will fill up with gas, and they will float. Because the swim bladder is actually there to help them with buoyancy. If they fill it up, they begin to float. If they let it out, they sink. Perfect if you're alive. If you're dead, you don't have any, control over it or power over it. So most fish, when they die, will bloat, they'll float, and then very, very quickly, they will actually become destroyed, away, nothing left. Hey, if you buried that fish in that state on the screen now, would you get a beautifully preserved fossil with all the fins and everything, just like our fossil fish in the UK? No, you wouldn't. If you want to fossilize a fish with that level of detail, you need to bury it very quickly indeed. Okay, once again, a reminder, test all things, hold fast to what is good. Because you see, as we went around, we started getting some critiques. I've been using this argument for a long time, right? And I started getting some critiques. The critiques were that under some conditions, fish can sink and stay on the sea floor. Okay, and I looked it up, and they're right. under some conditions, fish can sink and stay on the seafloor. And they do this for two reasons. The first one is some fish don't actually have a swim bladder. Sharks are a classic example of this. Sharks just sink to the bottom of the floor when they die. Also, in some conditions, if the water is very, very cold, the swim bladder or the air bladder actually contracts. It doesn't bloat at all. It contracts, it goes the opposite, and the fish will sink. Of course, the critiques went on to say, if fish can sink and stay on the seafloor, therefore the fish that sink to the floor can become fossilized. Therefore, you can get fish fossils without a flood and or catastrophic burial. That was the argument that was used. All right, remember, test all things, hold fast to that which is good. Fish can sink to the seafloor under some conditions, but you still have to get past one final hurdle. Let me introduce you to a small fungus. This is a fungus. You see the fish eggs there? It's common in aquariums. These are fish eggs that it's eating. You see, I once was given this presentation and I was talking through this problem, and I had a guy come up to me afterwards and said, you know what, you're absolutely right, but this may help you. I'm actually a fish farmer. I farm fish for commercially, you know, for eating. And he said, whenever we have a fish die, there is a race against time to get that fish out of it, out of the tank, before it actually begins to rot. He said, and this is the reason why. When my fish die, they're in cold water tanks, so they start to sink. They will sink and settle on the sea floor, on the tank floor. And then, no matter what we try and pump into the tank, it doesn't seem to kill it. This fungus will come up, will actually anchor itself onto the fish, so it will attach the fish to the seafloor, anchored it in place, and then within a matter of hours, it will actually destroy that fish beyond recognition. And we have to get into the tank and get rid of that rotting fish before it contaminates the rest of the tank. And we do a bit of research, remember testing all things, do a little bit of digging, and you find that this fish is actually found all throughout the world, or this fungus rather, sorry, is found all throughout the world in various different forms, whether it's in freshwater streams, saltwater streams, or elsewhere. You see, this fungus destroys the fish very, very quickly. The point? Would you get a fish fossil slowly, even if the fish sank to the bottom of the sea and stayed there? Answer? Absolutely not. The fish would be destroyed long before it could be fossilized. You see, if you want to make a fossil fish, you actually need to have three things in place. You need it to be buried extremely quickly, you need it to be buried very deeply, and you need it to be buried without the presence of oxygen. If you do not have those three things, you will never get a fossil. Our point, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. Get the process right, you get a quick fossil. Get the process wrong, it's not just a case of get the process wrong, it takes millions of years to make a fossil, because if you get the process wrong and you add time into the equation, then time is going to destroy your creature long before you have a chance to actually turn it into a fossil. Nothing to do with time, everything to do with a process. You can find out more about our fossils in Tights, Mites and Fossil Fights. I co-authored this book with John Mackay. You may well have mentioned it. If you go to creationresearch.net and click on shop, we've got shops in the USA and the UK and Australia and New Zealand, so you can actually buy this fossil book, as well as many other evidences to show that the Earth is young. You can also find out more about our museums project. We're just in the process. You can see Creation Research Centre. Yes, I'm sorry to our USA listeners in. We spell centre slightly differently over here in the UK. So creationresearchcentre.com. We are going to start a project where we are putting up, hopefully 1 or 2 a day, a new artifact, a new fossil, a new exhibit onto our website. The website's still under construction at the moment, but we're going to try and get a new thing on there every day, so you can start to see our catalogue of absolutely marvellous fossils and artifacts and things that God has enabled us to be able to get over the years. You can find out more about the UK ministry at creationresearch.net or creationresearchuk.com. You can also find out about some fabulous fossil books for kids, like What Happened to the Dinosaurs, Tights, Mites and Fossil Fights, Your Questions About Creation Answered, Who Made All the Dinosaurs. stuff for adults and kids alike, which really delves into that question of how do we know that the Bible is true from the very beginning? Here's another example, because we're dealing with fossils here. We're also dealing with Noah's flood. And what has that got to do with paleobiology? What has that got to do with fossils? Well, this is the UK. You can see Scotland at the top, England down the bottom, Wales is over to the right, and the little island, Wales is over to the left, and you can see the little island to the left as well is Ireland. Let's take you a little bit closer, because I'm going to introduce you to a research project of mine, which has basically been a lifelong obsession with this place. This is Hunstanton. Hunstanton is, well, let me show you exactly where it is. There's the UK again. England is the highlighted place. Over in the little red patch is Norfolk. That's where I originally hail from. Let's take you into Norfolk. There's, over there is West Norfolk. There's West Norfolk blown up, and Hunstanton is just about there. I mean, England isn't the biggest of countries in the world, and Hunstanton is just a tiny little portion of that country. What I'm going to try and do is explain to you a bit about fossils and the flood with Hunstanton, and then match it up to the world, so you can get a bigger perspective. All right, Hunstanton. What's so fascinating about it? Well, let's get behind the geology. You can see it's got some wonderful different colours there, 3 different colours. At the bottom you have the karstone, that sort of mottled brown rock there. It's a sandstone. In the middle you have the wonderful striking red Hunstanton Formation. That's a chalk, a red chalk. And at the top you have the Ferriby Chalk Formation, which is your bog standard white chalk, right? The Hunstanton Formation and the Ferriby Formation are full of fossils. Okay, let's get in a bit deeper. What are the supposed dates? Well, according to secular evolution, the karstone at the bottom is 109 million years. The Ferriby Chalk Formation at the top is 99 million years, and the red chalk in between the two of them is 101 million years, supposedly. Okay. Remember our Bible verse earlier from 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast to what is good. Let's actually do some testing on Hunstanton here, because you can actually take this principle, even though Hunstanton is a tiny, a tiny little segment of the world, you can take this principle and apply it just about anywhere. We are actually going to test those dates. Well, you find lots of fossils inside Hunstanton. You can see this wonderful fossil we dug up a few years back now. You see the curly-whirly ammonite in the middle picture, the big curly-whirly fossil, and sitting on top of that curly-whirly ammonite is a shark's tooth pressed into the ammonite. And then to the right-hand side of the ammonite, you can see a sea urchin. You can also see I've labelled the strata. Strata is layers, by the way. It's a technical geologist's term. You see the layers. Can you see how the sea urchin is actually sitting up through the layers? It's not sitting flat on the bottom at all. Now, this is very important as we delve into this, so bear that in mind. There's the sea urchin there. It's sitting up sideways. It's on its side. It's not lying flat. You see, one thing that, remember what my thing was, I was supposed to study paleobiology. Paleobiology is the study of living things in the fossil record, or certainly matching them up to ecosystems. Now, paleobiology teaches that creatures live, creatures die, and creatures get buried in the same place. Well, this isn't buried how it was living. It's been turned on its side. And you see the little green thing I've put on the top there? That's a modern day sea urchin that I picked up on the beach. Hasn't changed one bit, as opposed 99 million years old, and it's still a sea urchin. So it hasn't changed in that 99 million years. In fact, it's been doing exactly what God told it to do, which is reproduce after its own kind. Of course, that begs the question, if it's gone for 99 million years without changing one bit, why does it have to be 99 million years old? Interesting. Let's delve a bit deeper. Introduce you to another fossil, this time from the red chalk, that Hunstanton Formation. This is a brachiopod, by the way. It's about 2 inches tall for our American viewers. For UK, that's about 5 centimeters tall. That's what it looks like today. There's a living example on the right-hand side there, and on the left-hand side you can see a diagram which shows you how this is supposed to sit up in the real world. You can actually look, if we go back a little bit, can you see, I'll get my laser pointer out, one second, if I can find my mouse, there we are. You see this little sort of hole at the top here? They all have this. This is where a little tube attaches. There's the tube just down there. You can see it attaches it to the bottom of the sea floor. That's this bit over here. And it sits upright and it can open and shut the two halves of the shell. Now, this way that we had this brachiopod laid out is exactly how we find them in the rocks. In other words, they didn't live there and die there and get buried there, because this brachiopod is actually turned upside down on its back. Interesting what you can actually find when you dig these fossils up. They're all like this, by the way. There's a brachiopod, and there's another one. Can you see how it's sitting up through the rock? Can you see how the layers, there's the layers over here, and how it's sitting up through the layers? Interesting. All right, let's go back to the dates. 109 million years supposedly at the bottom, 99 million years at the top. How would you challenge this? Well, 109 minus 99 equals 10 million years. In other words, according to those dates, it took 10 million years to form, to lay down, to deposit Hunstanton cliffs, right? 10 million years to lay down Hunstanton cliffs, if the dates are accurate. If the dates are correct, it took 10 million years to create these. So how tall are they? Well, the cliffs there are about 20 meters or 65 feet. All right, well, I'm going to do a math equation now, and I apologize to our American friends. We're going to use metric for it because it's a lot easier to get your head around it. 109 million years at the bottom, 99 million years at the top. That means that it took 10 million years to lay down 20 meters of sediment if the dates are correct. So how do we test them? Well, it's simple. You take 20,000 millimeters, which, by the way, is the same as 20 meters. 20 meters is 20,000 millimeters. So it took 10 million years to lay down 20,000 millimeters. So you simply divide the height of the cliff by the time that it supposedly took to form it, according to the dates, and you get 0.002 millimeters per year, or 0.00007 inches per year. I mean, that's a tiny amount. Can you put your fingers that close together? No. Okay, ask yourself this question then. If these dates are accurate, that means that it took 14,285 years to deposit 1 inch of sediment, or 28,000 years to bury the brachiopod. Let me ask you another question. There's the brachiopod there. It would have taken about, well, in excess of 28 million years to actually just bury that brachiopod, let alone fossilize it. Would you ever get a fossil if it really took that length of time? No, you wouldn't, not in the slightest. That fossil, that creature would be destroyed long before. I mean, 28,000 years? That's a ridiculous length of time just to bury the brachiopod. And the beauty of this equation is that all we've done, we've put two things in, two pieces of data. One of them is an absolute piece of data, that's the height of the cliffs. The other one is a, you could call, theoretical piece of data. It's the supposed ages that it took, the supposed time that it took to lay these cliffs down. And you get a ludicrous result. The point, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with a process. If you want to fossilize these things, you need to bury them very, very quickly. Of course, again, you get lots of critiques as you go around. You see, chalk is a limestone. Limestone is supposed to deposit in shallow marine environments. It's supposed to take a very long time to form. And the critique was, well, deposition would not actually be constant when it was. You see, what we've done, we've taken the date at the bottom, the date at the top, we've worked out how long it supposedly took to form according to the dates and divided it to get an equal measurement. And the argument is, well, that doesn't actually work because deposition may have sped up, it may have slowed down, it could be all over the place. Well, it's a valid critique, but it doesn't actually work. You see, what you then have to do is say, well, what does the evidence indicate about deposition? What does the evidence from the fossils actually show us about how these fossils actually formed? delve in a bit deeper, you find that Hunstanton has got a whole wealth of evidence. Fossils there were buried rapidly, there's no doubt about it. Just the simple presence of a fossil there shows that it was buried very rapidly. You find these rapid fossils buried all throughout the deposits. So the next question is, do you find evidence of currents and flow? Again, remember what I was taught in university as a paleobiologist. You're supposed to dig up fossils and reconstruct an ecosystem. The idea is that the creatures lived, died, and were buried in the same environment. So what evidence is there? Is there any evidence that these creatures did not live, die, and bury there? Is there any evidence that these creatures were swept into position? Well, yes, there is. I wrote this paper a few years back now in 2017 titled The Evidence of Transportation and Rapid Burial in the Fossils of Hunstanton. It was a 3-month research project into Hunstanton, specifically looking for evidence of transportation. Transportation in fossil terms means evidence of fast-flowing currents which moved the fossils into position with a slurry of sediment and buried them in a transported state, as opposed to living, dying, and being buried in the same location. We looked for evidence of transportation during both the formation of the Hunstanton and Ferriby formations, as well as while those fossils were being buried. What did we find? 93% of fossils showed transportation. I mean, I used the example earlier of the brachiopod that was sitting upright in the layers. That's evidence of transportation. It didn't live and die and bury there. It was whipped up, turned upside down, and buried like that. Evidence of transportation. Belemnites, the sort of elongated, bullet-shaped creatures, all pointing in the same direction. That's evidence of transportation. Fast-flowing water. Therefore, when these fossils were formed in water, when these fossils were formed, the water was flowing in one direction. These fossils were being caught up in a slurry of sediment before being buried very rapidly and then fossilized. You see, we actually have documented a lot about Hunstanton and a lot about the work that we do in the Rocks Cry Out project. You can see our team there. We travel around the UK filming documentaries, filming short little pieces of evidence about these locations and putting them up for free on our Creation Research YouTube channel that you can actually watch, so you can get to grips with some of the geology. And just like Hunstanton, which is a tiny little segment of the Earth's, the Earth's surface, you can take that process, that principle behind it, and actually bring it forward to find evidence and use that evidence around the world. So you can also buy the books online, which goes into a lot more detail, including our famous Jurassic Coast about Mary Anning. Hunstanton goes a lot more into detail about these fossils, that you can actually find evidence for them in the rocks, including that research paper which I published. And we've got a special deal on Creation Research Store at the moment, so do check that out. But let's start to sort of wrap this all together as we sort of finish this. Let's wrap it all together and give you that evidence of a worldwide flood, because Hunstanton is a tiny little location, so let's use those same principles but put it on a much bigger scale. Let's take you to Cheddar Gorge in the UK. I love Cheddar Gorge. It's sort of our equivalent in the UK, or the closest thing in the UK we have to the Grand Canyon. It is pretty marvellous. Cheddar Gorge is, it's a lot smaller though, by the way. It's a wonderful place. Lots of great fossils, lots of great limestone. Limestone similar to chalk. This is actually Carboniferous limestone. Don't get hung up on the names, by the way. Carboniferous literally means it's full of carbon. This is where coal comes from. Again, I have to remember we have people all around the world viewing this, so let me give it its American name. You see, most of the original geologists were British, and of course the British geologists gave them their own name, and the Americans couldn't possibly use the British names for it. So rather than Carboniferous, they named them Pennsylvanian and Mississippian rocks. Pennsylvanian rocks, the rocks that were first studied by the Americans in Pennsylvania. Mississippian, ones that were studied in Mississippi. You see, names, these big, long, complicated technical names, they have nothing to do with millions of years in evolution, but everything to do with where they were first studied or what they're actually made up of. So let's take you to Cheddar Gorge. let's dig up some fossils. Let's see what we can find. You see all those little white flecks that you see on the rock behind me? They're all fossils. Fossils like this, a brachiopod. Just like the brachiopods in Hunstanton. Wonderful fossils, by the way. Marvelous brachiopod shells. Great stuff that you can find all throughout Cheddar Gorge. Well, there's a brachiopod shell there. Keep a good look at it because it's important to remember, because what you actually find is all these brachiopod shells are all buried together, buried in water. They're marine. They've all been washed together, which equals a flood. You see, limestone is a water-based sediment, so it was buried in a flood. It was buried by water. Well, let's take you to Australia, Georgia's home country, and you can see this is a plaque at a very famous set of caves in New South Wales. It says, this plaque celebrates the sister cave relationship between Cheddar Show Caves and Jenolan Caves, New South Wales, Australia. You see, Cheddar Gorge has many caves running through them, Cheddar, Goff's Cave and all sorts of marvellous stuff, and it's actually twinned with Jenolan Caves. Okay, let's have a little dig around Jenolan Caves then, in Australia. It's sort of located around the Blue Mountains in Australia. I visited here a few years back. There's another much, much bigger canyon than Cheddar Gorge, and there's the caves behind me. I visited here in 2018 during a creation research trip to Australia. Guess what rock it is? Carboniferous limestone. The same Carboniferous limestone that you find over in England. In fact, you find it all the way through Europe and Asia, running down to Australia. It's the same limestone. It's the same deposit. It's the same rock formation. Because look, there's the brachiopod shells. Same shells, same formation, same rock, same layers. Hey, this formation is nearly 16,000 kilometers across. That is a really big flood. Okay, well, let's use another example. Carthage in Tennessee, a USA example. Can you see the rock layers there in the sort of roadside cut through? What is this rock type? This is Ordovician limestone. Ordovician, okay, it's a different type of rock. It's a very similar rock, but it's a slightly different type of rock to the Carboniferous limestone. This is Ordovician limestone. Ordovician, well, in Wales, in the United Kingdom, where we're split into 4 countries. Over in the west, there's Wales. In Wales, there used to live a lot of Celtic tribes many, many years ago, before the Romans invaded. Celtic tribes. These Celtic tribes, one of which were named the Ordovici. By the way, this tribe is now extinct. It no longer is alive, this tribe of people. When the geologists first started digging up fossils in South Wales, they actually came across some other extinct creatures. So they decided to name the rocks that these extinct creatures came from, called trilobites, after the tribe of extinct people that used to live there, the Celtic people, and they named them the Ordovician rocks after the Ordovici tribe. Ordovician limestone from Carthage in the USA. This Ordovician limestone, by the way, is found all throughout the USA, and guess what's in it? Fossils! Brachiopod shells. Brachiopod fossils. Interesting. More brachiopod fossils. And a wonderful crinoid fossil mess. Look at all those fossils crammed together. By the way, a big fossil mess equals a flood, where currents have come through and ripped it up and tossed it about and dumped it down in a slurry of rock sediment. The point? It's got nothing to do with time, everything to do with the process. But I've said that before. All right, well, let's go back to the UK and make that same match that we did for Cheddar Gorge and Jenolan Caves. This is the Lake District. Very beautiful place, very famous place. Hey, look, it's Ordovician limestone. The same Ordovician limestone that was in the USA. In Carthage. Go inside some of our caves, wonderful waterfalls in there, wonderful limestone formations there as well. And guess what? Brachiopod shells. The same brachiopod shells that were in Carthage in Tennessee and are found all throughout the USA. Brecon Beacons in Wales. Guess what? Ordovician limestone with trilobites in it. They're the trilobites that had to do with the story of how the Ordovician rocks were named Ordovician. And there's another trilobite fossil from Carthage in the USA. Hey, this one is 6,460 kilometers apart, or 4,000 miles apart. That's a really big flood. But guess what? That is a really, really big flood. The same type of formation, the same water-based sediment, the same fossils, the same flood deposit covering most of the Earth's surface. Hey, that's a really big flood deposit. You see, the evidence is there when you actually look. You just need to know what to look for. And again, it's got nothing to do with time, everything to do with a process. So what can we actually find out from these rocks? The stuff that's in Carthage, Tennessee, the White Cliffs of Dover, the Ordovician limestone, all this stuff that you find, the limestone formations around the world. Well, there's one important thing, and it really goes to show the not time but process point. Inside all of these caves, both in the USA, in Jenolan Caves, in Cheddar Gorge, you see these wonderful stalactite and stalagmite formations. Again, supposedly take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years to form, because it's apparently such a slow process. Okay, test all things, hold fast to what is good, let's do some testing, let's actually find out how long it really takes to make these stalactites and stalagmites. So let's take you to my local village. This is the next village along from where I live in Shropshire. Chirk is just inside Wales, and it has a canal tunnel in it. You know the old English canals? All right, well, let's take you inside. What's growing from the ceiling? Stalactites and stalagmites. Well, this tunnel is just a couple of 100 years old, yet there's stalactites growing from it. There's fabulous formations all down the sides of it. You can actually match them up with real ones in caves. Exactly the same, no difference in the slightest. Marvellous veils of this, they're called splenotherms, or, stalactites or stalagmites. Beautiful stuff inside a very young canal tunnel. Okay, get up nice and close. Can you see the beautiful stalactite? You can catch the dripping water from it. You see, we've had critiques to say that these stalactites growing inside the tunnel aren't the same as the ones in caves because their pH measurement is different. How alkaline or how acidic something is. Well, you can test it. They match up exactly the same with caves. It's exactly the same, no difference at all. Hey, this happened in just a few hundred years inside Chirk Canal Tunnel. It doesn't take millions of years in the slightest. Hey, you can actually find this evidence all around the world, and it makes the point that it doesn't take millions of years to actually form these. It's got everything to do with a process. You can actually watch our documentary of Chirk Canal Tunnel for free on the rockscryout.co.uk or our Creation Research YouTube channel. I recommend you go and find out it and explore and find some evidence. There's so much that we could cover in just this short little segment that we're never going to get through it all. So do find out more on creationresearch.net or creationresearchcenter.com and actually find the truth and the true story of the world in light of the Bible. My final point, again, if you want to make a fossil, if you want to make a worldwide deposit, if you want to make any rock formation at all, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. Time is your biggest enemy when it comes to this kind of stuff. Well, that's the end of my slideshow, so I'm going to stop sharing and see if we can come back onto the presentation.
Yes, I got to say, Indiana Joe, that was an amazing presentation, and I could probably speak for George when I say this, I'm already excited to watch it again to take more notes because the chat was very lively. We got a ton of good comments, questions.
Marvelous.
It really reminds me, Joe, of 2 Peter 3, where the scoffers are willingly ignorant of all this undeniable and overwhelming essentially evidence that points to the global flood. The world that then was being overflowed with water perished. So, and also one thing I kept thinking is your presentation was so detailed and informative that you answered and essentially refuted many of the best critics' arguments and questions anyways. I mean, you touched on so many good topics, so I wanted to make those comments before we got into any specific questions. Great presentation, Joe.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And George, I don't want to hog the mic, so before I ask any specific questions, did you have any comments to make over the presentation, George, or maybe you had a question you wanted to first ask?
Yes, thank you. I've watched most of those videos you referenced, Joe. I'm an avid subscriber of Creation Research YouTube. One observation on your photos is the clear boundary between the layers. Most people don't realize that's evidence in itself of quick layering rather than millions of years. Otherwise, you'd see erosion and soil deposition, etc.
Absolutely.
But as an engineer, I've done numerous structural inspections on bridges, and I've even seen stalactites on under bridges. Mm-hmm. And those bridges weren't there for millions of years.
No.
But this is a specific question on limestone formation. Mm-hmm. There are critics, and some of them are in the chat at the moment, who claim that this could not have been laid in turbulent water flow. Can you provide an explanation for where all the limestone came from and how it was laid? I believe John McKay, I think in our previous YouTube presentation, as well as some conversations I had with him at his house, mentioned limestone is really a chemical process.
Yeah, so there's two things to comment on it. The first one is where do we get the idea from that it's a shallow marine-based sediment? The other one is what is a different or alternative explanation to how this limestone actually formed, right? So the first thing you have to look at is, well, we get our idea of a shallow marine carbonate sort of calciferous ooze, as it's called beautifully, from modern deposits. Right, we go out and we look, we find in the real world some of these sort of chalky deposits at the bottom of shallow seas, which are slowly accumulating small things called coccolithophores. Coccolithophores are the sort of shells off of tiny little plankton, which they fall off, eventually clump together, sink down to the bottom of the sea floor, and begin to form this ooze. Now, this ooze builds up, and it's what is claimed to end up producing the limestone deposits. So it's forming around us today, right? But the argument is it happens so incredibly slowly that, and it really does form at the rates that very, very slow rates, like 1 inch per 1,000 years or whatever. It forms at extremely slow rates, and they say, well, therefore chalk and limestone, which has its base in this sort of ooze that we see forming today, must have taken millions of years to form. Well, there's a very simple way of disproving that and showing that you can't actually correlate the two, and that is to ask this. Number one, how many fossils are there buried in this califerous ooze or this modern-day limestone or chalk? The answer, absolutely none, because it is not being laid down fast enough to produce fossils. Number two, are there any creatures being trapped in it that are not being destroyed pretty quickly? The answer, no. It happens very, very quickly. The creatures, anything that lives around it, just gets destroyed and dies. Okay, question three. Is the ooze that is being formed today in a pure form? Because you see, when we go to the White Cliffs of Dover, it is pure chalk. There's no contamination. There's no sediment or muck or, rotting stuff caught up in it. It's brilliantly preserved and it's pure. Well, no, in modern day ooze scenarios, it's full of sediment and sand and fish poo and scales and all sorts of gross gunge, right? Now, if you want to argue that the present is the key to the past, which is, by the way, where the whole idea of millions of years actually came from, but that's a completely different topic. Charles Lyell, who promoted the idea that the present is the key to the past, that we have to use modern day observations to explain past geological events, well, that's how you get to the assumption that chalk has to form slowly and limestone has to form slowly. You go and look at modern day deposits and you see that they're forming slowly today. Therefore, that's how it always happened. Of course, the problem is you can't actually compare the two because they are so different. Because one forming today doesn't have fossils. It doesn't even have fossils forming. Fossils get destroyed, or creatures get destroyed as soon as they fall in. It's thoroughly contaminated with muck and gunge and ooze and, you know, disgusting stuff. Whereas when you go and look at the, you know, the rock, the limestone, the chalk, they're majority pure. They are full of fossils. They're all full of fossils which are pointing the same way, which indicates turbidity currents and flow. They are full of fossils which are turned upside down and are lying on their back, which shows that they've been transported. They're not in a life position. So clearly something doesn't match up between what we observe today and what we actually see in the rock record, right? Now, you can't just ignore the fossils and say, well, we know that limestone is a slow, gradual deposition, therefore that's how it must have happened, right? There needs to be an alternative explanation. There needs to be a way of actually addressing how you can actually get these rock deposits full of fossils. And by the way, 2 inches is a pretty small fossil compared to some of the things you can dig up out of the chalk cliffs. I mean, I've seen ammonite fossils, the curly-whirly ones, nearly 2 meters across. That's getting on for 6 feet, or just over 6 feet across, right? Some of these things are absolutely enormous. Okay, what's an alternative explanation then? Well, John Mackay, I believe, is, as you say, touched on it. I watched his interview that you did with him, and there certainly seems to be much more of a chemical process involved, something which most geologists have never actually considered, because most geologists are taught from day one that limestone is a very slow deposition. They never think to question that. And also because in science you are taught to specialize. You specialize on one particular aspect and you never really go outside of your academic field. I want to give you an example of this. Myself and John have noticed that there are extremely important connections between microbes, bacteria, plankton, you know, little sort of multicellular, single cellular microscopic creatures, enzymes, chemical processes, and limestone formation. Whether that's limestone like the Carboniferous Limestone, whether that's limestone like the chalk, or whether it's limestone like the stalactites and stalagmites. And this is starting to reach the scientific papers, right? So we thought we need to do some investigation. We're both geologists. We come from a geology background. We know wonderful stuff about geology, but what we don't know too much about is organic chemistry, which is where this chemical process comes in. And a few people have touched on it. So we went and sat down with a world expert in organic chemistry who said to us, I've never thought of looking at it that way before, and I wish I knew more about this, but I'm not a geologist. And so for the first time ever, a geologist and an organic chemist sat down and actually started to work together, right? So you will never find the correct answer to anything unless you ask the correct questions. Just blindly going, well, we know that it's a shallow marine deposit, therefore I'm not going to ask the question, how did we get fossils? It just simply doesn't work. Okay. Is there a way that we can explain it rapidly happening using a Noah's flood-like scenario? Well, this comes on to a different point, and I'll just briefly comment onto it. First of all, we know that the Hunstanton Formation, we know that the Chalk Formation, we know that the Limestone Formations had to be buried quickly because they're full of fossils. The fossils all indicate flow. They all indicate rapid burial. Okay, how are we taught from day one that rock formations are formed? The answer is from the bottom to the top. The bottom layer got there first, and the next layer settled on top, and the next layer, then the next layer, and the next layer, and the next layer, and so on and so forth. And there you get your wonderful geologic column from bottom to top with the label of millions of years. First proposed by a creationist, by the way, Nicholas Dino. The problem is, everything we see in the world around us shows that rock layers don't form bottom to top, they form sideways. Because if you need to get sediment to actually form a deposit, you need to erode that sediment from somewhere, you need to carry that sediment from somewhere, and you need to have moving sediment in order to deposit. All of that requires water which is flowing sideways, carrying that slurry of stuff in it. Think about a beach, think about tides, think about rivers, think about deltas. Okay, scale that up, and you've got the perfect explanation for a stationary but moving sideways, so the particles are all suspended, moving at the same speed, carrying the limestone and the chalk along and depositing it as it's going. burying the creatures which are also traveling in the one direction. Now, there's a lot more research to do about that. There's a lot more research to do into the chemical aspect of limestone, but simply saying we know it's a slow gradual deposition doesn't work. The fossils go to show that, and if you want to try and match it up to any slow gradual process, that is worlds away from anything that we see in the real world.
Well, they have observed limestone during volcanic eruptions as well, Joe. But going back to the limestone and the fossils, there are fossils that are found in limestone layers, and if we marry that up with that 1 to 3 centimeter per 1,000-year deposition rate, you find it's clearly impossible, because there's a video on YouTube where they show a carcass of a whale. It was scavenged within a year, I think. They came back a year later. They even found the worms were eating the bones.
Yeah, I think that was a David Attenborough Blue Planet type of thing, wasn't it? I think I know which one you're talking about. And it shows you a year later, and it's just destroyed. There's no way you can get it if you want to get, especially with that level of preservation. Where you have to bury a fossil quickly, deeply, without oxygen. If it's going to be a slow, gradual process, even if you're talking 28,000 years, just to bury the thing, not fossilize it, just to bury it, you're never going to get a fossil. It's a ludicrous result.
Yeah, well, I know a lot about the process. I mean, there's also fossilization in amber as well. That's, I guess, a different form of fossilization. We find different creatures fossilized in amber than we do, say, in the sedimentary layers across the world. But Standing, you've got a question there?
Yeah, I've got about 300 of them. So, Joe, I hope you've got time for about 10 hours of interview. I'm just kidding. I got to say, that was a great response. I think that was the most detailed, informative response I've ever heard on that topic in question. And you kind of answered 2 in 1, essentially 10 in 1. I know you touched on the chalk and the limestone, so that's awesome, since a lot of questions came in on those specific topics. It really demonstrates how readily we can have an answer to even the critics' best arguments and criticism. So I want to thank you for that, Joe. And although we've had a ton of questions come in, I'm going to go all the way back to the first question that came in over an hour ago from Ryan the Raptor guy. So thank you so much, Ryan, for your question. And his question is, for Joseph, what is your opinion on the flood / post-flood boundary?
Okay. A lot of creationists have done a lot of detailed research into this, and they've written many papers on it. And it's a fascinating study. It's where can we actually define flood and post-flood boundary? So which rocks are definitely flood deposited, which rocks are post-flood deposited? Now, creationists have been looking for, basically ever since sort of the modern creationist phenomena has been around, for the flood post-flood boundary. They still haven't got a definitive answer. There's strong opinions on both sides, but there isn't a definitive answer. And I think the reason that there isn't a definitive answer is because there is no such thing as here's a nice straight line that goes across everything. Everything above this is post-flood, everything underneath this is pre-flood. And that goes back to what I was alluding on earlier, to the process of sideway deposition, right? The Geologic Column was first proposed by Nicholas Steno in the mid-1600s, 1650s. He was a Christian, a creationist who believed in the Bible, believed in the Word of God, ended up actually becoming a monk. Because of his studies, sort of led him to Christ. And he's sort of considered the founding father of paleontology, because he was really the first person to say, hey, if you can find a creature in the rock, it probably is that creature just turned to stone. as opposed to the Greeks spread down through ancient sort of through the Middle Ages in Europe, which claimed that it was either the Greek gods that put them there as a joke or Satan had put them there to trick us, right? That was what they believed for millennia, basically. And it wasn't until Nicholas Dino first proposed them as fossils that the science really took off, right? So we have a lot to thank him for. And he said, I can see these rock layers. It makes the most sense that the bottom one got laid down first and the top one got laid down last. So that's how I'm going to do my research. Right? Skip forward a few years and you get to James Hutton, who took that one step further and said, well, if the bottom layer got there first and the top layer got there last, that means the bottom layer is the oldest, the top layer is the youngest. Take it forward to Charles Lyell, who said, well, if the bottom layer is the oldest and the top layer is the youngest, then what we actually have here is a representation of not process, like Nicholas Dino first thought, but actually time. We have oldest at the top, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. Therefore, this is a process of time, which we can see time through the ages. Take that one step further, because what Charles Darwin did is build on Charles Lyell's principle and said, well, if the bottom layer is the oldest, the top layer is the youngest, that's a process of time. That means fossil creatures in the bottom layer evolved into the fossil creatures in the next layer, and so on and so forth, all the way to the top. Do you see the line of succession here from a relatively innocent idea all the way through to the idea of millions of years evolution, evidenced by the rocks and the fossils? All right, let's go back to square one, because Nicholas Dino had a brilliant idea, but ever since it was sort of hijacked by the sort of people with a secular agenda, it's been used to promote this idea of millions of years, that the bottom layer got there first, so on and so forth. So the whole stratigraphic geological column has been based around this principle of millions of years. And the problem is, I mean, you've done the classroom experiment, haven't you? You got a glass of water, you put muck, and you put stones, and you put little pebbles, and you put big pebbles, and you put big boulders and sand in it. You put the top, you shake it up like that, and you watch it all settle bottom to top. Well, that would be a wonderful example if the world was a glass of water, but it's not. The reality is, in the real world that we see around us, all sediments being carried, all sediments being deposited, are all being carried and deposited by water flowing sideways. And if you go to creationresearch.net and click on the research page, you'll find a whole host of experiments to do with flumes. We've had scientists from around the world and engineers and rocket scientists get together and help design this. I was involved with some of the initial experiments back in 2018 to show you how these rock layers form sideways. Now, if this is a correct interpretation of the way that we see the world around us, which we can observe today, because the brilliant thing about water is that it always behaves the same, whether it's a little tiny bit of it or it's a huge amount of it, it just happens at different scales, right? So if this is the way that we observe the rocks today and the way that rock formations actually happen and get deposited, then you can take it one step further and say, what would we be looking for if we're looking for evidence of a flood? Because clearly the column, which a lot of creationists use to try and put a line through to say this is all flood rock, this is all post-flood rock, isn't going to work anymore, because that entire column is based off of a evolutionary secular idea. Well, what you need to look for are a few things like, well, how big is the deposit? When we used the Carboniferous deposit earlier, it was buried by water, it was definitely buried in a flood, and it covered most of the world. No arguing, that is a flood deposit, and it's Noah's flood deposit. It's a huge deposit. All right, well, what about the Jurassic sediments? Go all around the world, absolutely huge, same deposit, full of fossils, all with drowned dinosaurs in them. It's a flood deposit. What about the chalk? Well, you can go and travel from England and Ireland across to Normandy and France, all the way down through Africa and Asia. It even turns up, the chalk at least, turns up on the west coast of Australia. All the same deposit, all sitting on the same bed of sandstone. It is all a flood deposit. It's a massive deposit. So you're looking things that have been buried in a flood, so you're looking for evidence of a flood, and you're also looking for evidence of large scale. For post-flood deposits, there's going to be a way of actually viewing and telling whether it's a post-flood. Is going to be a lot more localized. It's going to be catastrophic, because you need a catastrophe on some scale to actually form a fossil. So it's going to be catastrophic, but it's going to be a lot more smaller. It's going to be a lot more less sediment based. So the reality is the whole idea of the millions of years based geologic column it's going to be very hard to just draw a straight creationist line through it. So what you need to do is take each deposit individually, know what you're looking for when you're looking for evidence of a flood or not a flood, and actually make up good judgments about it based on the evidence which you're looking at. So if you want to get the closest thing to a line, you're kind of looking at end of Cretaceous, beginning of Cenozoic, somewhere in there. But there are some Cenozoic deposits, which I know many people like Mike Ward and myself believe are flood deposits. There are even some Cretaceous deposits, which I think could quite possibly be post-flood deposits. They're just too small to be on that larger scale. So I don't think you're going to find there's a nice straight line which shows you everything, because the straight line itself is based on the idea of millions of years in evolution, which is what the stratigraphic column is actually based on. So there's a few thoughts. There isn't a one size fits all answer, but hopefully that's a few thoughts to help you sort of take the investigation further.
Oh, that's great, Joe. I remember reading a conference paper that comes from 1933, where they found bird tracks in a Carboniferous layer, and because they couldn't explain it, they just simply label it out of place fossil. I always say it's not an out of place fossil. It's the theory that's out of place, not the fossil.
Let me give you another very quick example. Going back to the Ordovician limestone, right, in Carthage in Tennessee. Done a lot of research. I didn't include it in here, but you can actually go and find fossil plants in the Ordovician limestone. And we've dug them up, we've shown them, we've taken photographs. It's even got little fossil thorns on them. It's a little tiny fossil called Sordonia. Now, there's a problem with having Sordonia in the Ordovician limestone. According to the theory of evolution, the land plants like Sordonia weren't supposed to have evolved for another 40 million years. So he took these fossils to the world expert in university in Canada on fossil thorns and Sordonia plants. And he looked at them and he said, yeah, no doubt about it, these are Sordonia, they're little fossil thorns. But where did you find these? We said, Carthage, Tennessee. He said, you can't have. We said, why? He said, because these are actually Devonian. They've got to be Devonian because the fossils are Devonian. Are you sure you haven't made a mistake? And we said, no, we had our, Department of Geology, University of Tennessee geologist with us who said that these are Ordovician rocks. And so we rang Bob up and we said, hey, are these definitely Ordovician rocks? He said, yeah, they're definitely Ordovician rocks. We said, well, we have a professor here who says they can't be. And so we took them back to the Department of Geology and said, look, here's these fossils. The professor says that these have got to be 40 million years older. So they said, no, we haven't got it wrong at all. We haven't got it wrong in the slightest. We can't have got it wrong. These are definitely Ordovician. So you see, there's little discrepancies all the way throughout it. And it just shows where the bias lies when you're actually coming to dating these rocks. They don't look through all the evidence. By the way, the fact that we found fossil thorns down there doesn't matter how old you want to claim that they are. What it means is that from a biblical perspective, those rocks were formed after Adam sinned. Because according to the Bible, thorns and thistles and prickles came onto the planet after Adam sinned, and they were not there before. So there's a little interesting thought to leave you with.
Joe, I think standing will allow me to ask this question. One of our outstanding critics is a person by the name of Erica, aka Gutsy Gibbon. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this commonly asked question: what are the differences between man and the great apes?
Okay, that's we have 2 or 3 presentations on this. Each of them an hour long, so I'm not going to cover everything in one simple thing. But first of all, let's just the one that's commonly proposed, or the similarity that's commonly proposed, is the DNA, or the fact that our bone structure is very similar, or brain, or so on and so forth, right? And you can great big thick books on evolution. I studied evolution at university, and the one thing that I noticed is that over and over and over again, they always talk about the similarities between us. What they never talk about is the differences. Yeah. Now, that to me is a very strange concept, because if you're trying to prove that we evolved from something, surely you want to take the differences into account, because it's the differences that determine how far along the evolution line you are. And it's just something that is never really discussed, the differences between humans and apes. The reason why is because the differences are extremely great. The whole 99% DNA thing is a whole different topic to be dealt with, and it's not 99% the same anyway, and that's a whole different thing. But just one thing to give you a little thought on about the 99% similar to ape DNA is, if we genuinely are 99% or 98% similar DNA to chimpanzees, think of the geniusness of design that went into the DNA in order to make the vast amount of differences that we have between the two creatures, humans and apes, in just 2% of DNA. I mean, that alone screams that there was a designer behind it, because that's an incredible amount of information to try and fit in 2% of the DNA. But there's a little thought. But some of the differences include things like not just skeletal structure, so jaw shape, pelvis shape, foot shape, so on and so forth. Not just little differences like having the whites of the eyes, like being able to have emotions. By the way, according to the Bible, we're made in the image of God. Specifically, we're made in the image of Jesus, who is the creator. John 1 says all things were made by the word, who is Jesus Christ, and without the word nothing was made that was made. Colossians 1:16 says that all things were made not only by Jesus Christ but for Jesus Christ. And you find that one of the shortest verses in the Bible says Jesus wept. Jesus wept. We weep because we are made in the image of God, who did weep when he came to the earth. By the way, monkeys don't cry. Neither do apes or gorillas or anything else supposedly are distant cousins. They can't cry. Certainly not in the same way that we do, and certainly not with emotion. Also, another thing, there a few years back, there was a baby who was born with essentially no heart, or a very deformed heart, and so in a spur sort of mist of panic, some surgeons actually tried to sew a gibbon's heart into the little baby's heart in the hope that it would actually continue to work. They should have known better, because coursing through every single great apes or New World monkey or whatever's veins is a whole group of acid. I think it's called salicylic acid, which is thoroughly toxic to human beings. So there's another major change. Also, how do humans reproduce? I won't go into detail, but to give you to put it into perspective, humans reproduce. The male has got a brilliant designed hydraulic system for actually transferring sperm from him into the female. When it comes to great apes and all other monkeys, they don't actually have that. They have a baculum. A baculum, or a penis bone, is a sharp, hard bone which the male uses to penetrate the female. I mean, if you want to, and by the way, if as far back as you can go, apes have always had this. So if you want to actually evolve into an ape that doesn't have that, then you need to have a major rewriting of information, which is something that we've never seen at all. No new information arising from non-information source. But that's verging onto the whole concept of design. So that's again a whole different topic. We can discuss it further, but it is a you could just go on and on and on and on.
Oh, definitely. Great answer, by the way. I guess the follow-up question was, what's the best way to determine whether or not a fossil or a bone is either human or ape when it comes to the fossil record?
Okay, there are very, very clear differences when it comes to the fossil record, and you can simply look for the differences that are in modern apes. One thing that we've found is every single supposed fossil that is, or every single fossil that is part of our supposed timeline can either be shown to be 100% human or 100% ape. There's simply nothing in between. So take, for instance, the famous Lucy fossil, Australopithecus afarensis. She is by every single definition an ape. She has got a V-shaped jaw, a very sharp V-shaped jaw, rather than a U-shaped jaw like we have. She has a pelvis, even though the first one was sort of reconstructed to, or whether it was deliberately reconstructed or misreconstructed to look like a bipedal or two-legged walker. Newer research, newer discoveries have found that she was absolutely bipedal. She walked on four legs. The original Lucy skeleton had very little finger bones. Newer discoveries have shown that she has got finger bones, and they have got extreme curvature on them, which means that she was a knuckle walker, like a great ape. Every single definition we can find shows that she was 100% ape. So there are specific things like shape of the jaw, shape of the hip, shape of the knuckles, and so on and so forth, that you can absolutely determine whether it is an ape or not. Likewise, for humans, U-shaped jaws, upright pelvis, flat feet as well. I mean, the definition of apes is that they have 4 hands, they have 4 thumbs that they use for hanging on. So if you have a flat feet like a human, then that's fantastic. You've got evidence of a human if you find the foot bones. By the way, if you can do this, and hopefully you can all do that, because that means you're human. If you can do all that with your fingers, apes cannot do that. But that means that we can actually hold a paintbrush in a way that an ape cannot, and use our creative skills to paint. But then that shouldn't surprise you, because we're made in the image of God, who is the great designer. Therefore, we design. And we... Of course, we can't create things the same that God can create, because he's a lot more powerful than we do, but we create, monkeys don't. So there are very specific differences between apes and humans, particularly with their skeletal systems. So when you actually dig up ape fossils, they can all be shown to be 100% ape or 100% human. We have yet to find anything in between.
George, if I could.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go on.
It's just, I'm curious as to your thought, and you did kind of answer this, but we hear it over and over again, this assertion, you know, and I hear it over and over again, made by the evolutionists. They assert that we are apes, humans are apes. And of course, they are basing this on man-made classification systems and taxonomy and nested hierarchies, right, in morphology, anatomy. What are your thoughts? What's your opinion when you hear that assertion that, hey, you know, we are apes essentially?
Yeah. So a few thoughts which I'll just there. First of all, there's a scientific perspective, then there's a biblical perspective. The two go in hand, by the way. But if you want to get a biblical perspective, you'll find that we are created in the image of God, and no other animal is. So certainly, whether or not that you want to argue whether the image of God is transferred physically, there is absolutely a spiritual aspect to it there. We are spiritual creatures, and so we are made in the image of God, which means we can experience things like emotion. We can experience a spiritual relationship with God. That's what we were created for. So there is, first of all, a major difference between us and apes, according to the Bible. We are made in the image of God. Apes are not. And that's sort of transcends into the enormous amount of differences that you can find between the two as well. From a scientific perspective, it's interesting how much observation or how much opinion is flawed by personal agenda or preconceived ideas or presuppositions even. Now, I have a presupposition. I make no qualms about it. It's the Bible, right? But the secular humanist or the secular evolutionist who claims that he is neutral, that he doesn't have an agenda, is actually lying to you. He does, absolutely. They always come with the preconceived idea that evolution is true, that apes evolved into humans, that dinosaurs evolved into birds, and that there is no God, right? They're all preconceived ideas for which you go into research to do. And so the results that you get are going to be affected by your preconceived ideas, by your presuppositions, right? There's no getting around that. It's the same for me, it's the same for you, it's the same for everybody on the planet, right? Because we are human beings and happen to be made in the image of God, and that affects the way that we do things, right? So what you will find is that this assertion that humans are no more than apes, or just, you know, slightly larger, less hairy, overbrained apes, is in fact a direct contradiction of the word of God. It's also a direct attack on the word of God. It's certainly not upheld scientifically. I mean, the whole assertion, we'll go into a bit deeper, the whole assertion of the DNA 98 or 99% similar can be easily disproved. That's based on very, very old and very rather outdated information. But in a nutshell, the way that the information came about, that claim that we were 98% similar, is because they looked at certain aspects or certain structures of the way that our DNA is created. Right. By the way, we also share 50-odd% with a banana. It's about 70-odd% with a worm, and so on and so forth. Right. What you're actually looking at is you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective to say, hey, we're really, really similar because X, Y, and Z. When the reality is, first of all, you need to look at the differences. We're not apes in the slightest. for the start, I'm standing in front of technology and talking to you and broadcasting it all over the world, and people are understanding that. Apes don't do that. Now, that may sound a bit cliche and a bit tongue-in-cheek, but follow the logic all the way through. Humans have got a spiritual aspect to them, which is all the way through the history, whether you believe in the true God or not. So there's definitely a spiritual aspect, which goes back to that being made in the image of God. But scientifically, the way that you do it is especially with the DNA, you're actually looking at similarities which are going to be similar. A better question would be, well, considering the differences, how great and amazing a designer this person had to have been to actually cram this amount of differences in such a small amount of DNA. Because the simplest little tiny difference can make completely different meanings. I mean, language is a fantastic example of that. And the classic example is, God is now here. Now, you don't have to change a single letter. You don't have to switch a single letter about, add anything in. All you have to do is delete one space and you get God is nowhere. A completely flipped meaning to just a tiniest percentage of change. So just because we have similar DNA, even if we do have similar DNA, doesn't mean that we're related to them in the slightest.
Joe, there are a couple of theistic evolutionists in the chat I've noticed, and I mentioned those bird tracks in the Carboniferous layer that they classified as out of place fossils. Mm-hmm. They claim that birds evolved from dinosaurs, okay, because of feathers on Archaeopteryx, etc. What would you say to a theistic evolutionist about God creating a process of evolutionary change that involved deformations, mutations, disease, death? Would a God really do that?
Well, he certainly could have done that. It's a perfectly valid way of God creating had he wanted to do that, but ultimately, so what about all the different ways that he could have done something? What I'm really interested in is how he did do it. I mean, a lot of theistic evolutionists get hung up over the idea of, well, God could have done this. And the answer is absolutely he could have done. He's God. Of course he could have done it. The issue is not could he have done this. The answer is, or the issue is, what did he do? You see, we have to start with the Bible as our authority, which, by the way, the doctrine of creation is directly connected to the legitimacy of Jesus Christ as our Saviour. Let me show you why. The chronologies which you find and the genealogies, I mean, they're pretty boring. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so, and then you fall asleep, right? But they're there for a very important reason. They're there to prove who Jesus Christ is. That's why the genealogies are there in Matthew and Luke. They're there to prove who Jesus Christ is, that he is legitimately descended, not just from David, like the prophecy said, but also from Adam. Why is it so important that Jesus Christ is descended from Adam? Why is it so important that he's 100% God and 100% man? Well, the reason is that if you read in the book of Leviticus, I think it's in chapter 13, it talks about the responsibility or the commandment of a redeemer. If you're going to redeem somebody, if you're going to try and redeem somebody who's done wrong, you have to be related to them. There's an order of kin. Right? So in order to actually redeem somebody from something they've done wrong, if you want to step in and take their place or take their punishment, you have to be related to them. That's a law of God. Also, there's this issue of priesthood. Jesus Christ is our great high priest, right? Well, you can read in Ezra chapter 3 Ezra's the priest who's coming back from captivity, taking some of the children of Israel and setting up the priesthood in the promised land once again after they've been in captivity, right, with the Babylonians. And it documents these three people who came back who should have been entitled to be a priesthood, should have been entitled to be a priest. The problem was they'd lost their grandfather's birth certificate. They had one missing link, and they could not actually prove who they were. They couldn't prove that they were legitimately from the line of priests. Therefore, the Bible says that they were cast out as defiled. Okay? One missing link is all it takes to destroy your legitimacy as a saviour. One link is all it takes to destroy the whole process and the whole point of being able to be a kinsman redeemer. Okay, who is Jesus Christ? He is our Redeemer and he is our great high priest. Therefore, his legitimacy as such is based directly upon the chronologies which are recorded in the Bible. That's why they're there, to prove that Jesus Christ is descended from Adam, because Romans says that one man brought sin and death into the world. Therefore, it takes one sinless man to bring life. Paul's logic is simple. Adam brought death. Jesus brings life. That's why he's called the last Adam, right? The first Adam brought sin and death. The last Adam is a life-saving being. It's based directly on the fact that Jesus Christ is descended from Adam. Now, if you want to argue that there are gaps in the genealogies and that the earth could be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years old, or that Jesus or that God chose, I think Dennis Alexander's, he's a prominent theistic evolutionist, I think his favoured story is that God chose a group of Neolithic farmers or cavemen, for want of a better word, and decided to have a relationship with them. Well, you can believe that if you want to, but it's certainly not biblical, and it certainly throws the legitimacy of Jesus Christ into question, because you're saying that Jesus Christ is not descended from Adam, the first created spirit who was made in the image of God. You're actually saying that he's, eventually, evolved or devolved from a group of cavemen or Neolithic, or even going further back, ape-like creatures. You're throwing the legitimacy of Jesus Christ into question. Now, you can argue that that's what you want to believe. You can argue to do with science. Hopefully tonight we've shown you some of the reasons why science certainly doesn't back up the idea of evolution or theistic evolution. But ultimately the question is, so what if God could have created like that? He said exactly how he created, and it wasn't like that. So who are you to question God? And who are you to actually question the authority of Jesus Christ? I think I'm going to stick with the authority, which is the word of God. And also one final thing, and it's controversial and very, very bold and a bit blunt, I know, but you need to get this point across sometimes. When you stand in front of God on a holy God on Judgment Day, and he asks you, why did you call me a liar? How exactly are you going to respond?
Amen. Amen. Very well said. Great answer. And great answers all around, especially to the previous question, Joe, on apes and differences, similarities. Very informative. And I wanted to point out, too, that even within those similar genetic sequences exist functional differences in terms of epigenetics and gene expression. So even in terms of the similarities themselves, there's a problem for the evolutionists. We also have orphan genes, for example, which have never been shown empirically to arise through any series of mutations. So I wanted to point that out because also you mentioned cavemen and the presuppositions of the evolutionists, because there's a question here that came on screen that I think is based on a false assumption that there have actually been evolutionary predictions when it comes to the hominin fossil record that have been confirmed. Because the question is, given that the oldest hominin fossils look less human-like and more ape-like, how do you explain this confirmation of evolutionary predictions? I think it comes down to, has this actually been confirmed?
Yeah, okay, so we found several ape fossils. What's interesting, or has always been interesting to me, is every time that a new ape fossil has been found, it's automatically assumed that it's in the lineage of apes to humans. Nobody ever stops to question, well, what about apes to apes? Because we have modern apes here today. The old standard idea is you had a central ancestor which split off into apes and humans. Well, what about this ape succession? What's happened to all of their fossils? Every time a fossil is a fossil ape or supposed ape hominin is found, it's automatically assumed to be in the human line. So that's the first point. It shows you the bias that people will actually go out looking for stuff. Secondly, this question of does it show a line of succession? Does it show a line of progression? Well, let's work backwards from humans, shall we? Let's go backwards to, let's say, Cro-Magnon man, a bigger human being, a bigger brain, more sturdier, more robust, but absolutely definitely human. Let's go back to Neanderthal, again, bigger brain, sturdier, robust. We know a lot about Neanderthals now. We know a lot about their DNA, and we actually can do DNA sequencing on Neanderthals and find out how many of you are descended from a Neanderthal, and it's a surprisingly large amount, right? So go back even further. The Neanderthals were human, there's no doubt about it. Go back even further, and I suppose the next one you could go to is Homo Erectus. Homo Erectus, Dating methods are based off of sedimentology and also things like carbon dating and so on and so forth. They all have their various flaws, and that's a whole nother hour topic, but let's just have a look at him for a minute. He's a smaller human being. He's got a bit of a smaller brain, but the reality is, if you look at his morphology, he is not more ape-like in the slightest. He is just a small, slightly deformed human being. Then you have a major gap, and all of a sudden your fossils you start finding are clearly apes. What we've not found is a system. I mean, you know the famous image, don't you, of ape going all the way up to human, monkey sort of standing on the ground and going up through this. It looks wonderful on paper, but the fossil evidence simply doesn't support that. Again, if you go through all of the evidence, you look at all of the different supposed evidence for evolution, you look through all the fossils, you can categorize them all as 100% human, you can categorize them all as 100% ape. There may be deformed apes, there may be deformed humans in there, but they're all absolutely genetically and scientifically either apes or humans. What we haven't found is a succession between the two. And what also is false is to say the further back you go, humans get more and more ape-like. They don't. They stay humans, and if anything, they get more human because they have bigger brains, they have more robust, they have exactly what we would associate with humans today. Things like art, things like organized religion, things like music or language or speech or a sense of politics or community. As far back as you can go, humans have always been humans.
That's a great response, Joe, especially considering our model would have a post-Babel dispersal. So you would have a lot of isolated people groups. You may even have some isolated ape types, and therefore inbreeding and mutation accumulation can lead to what you're talking about, deformities and mutation-related diseases. So
yeah,
it seems like a lot of evolutionists, they'll pick up these atypical bones, these anomalous bones, and they will hold it up like it's some big transition, when in fact it's just pathology and disease. So that's a really good point.
That's something that is a problem in all of paleontology. A friend of mine who's not a Christian or a creationist, by the way, but he's sort of sending shockwaves through the scientific community in many senses, because what he's doing is taking things like dinosaurs and specifically ichthyosaurs, and what he's doing is he's saying, hang on a minute, by the way, when you're doing paleontology, whatever, if you want a cheap and easy PhD, name a new species and describe a new species. Right? It's the easiest and greatest way of doing it. So scientists are constantly looking, especially students are constantly looking for new species, right? And so ichthyosaurs and dinosaurs had just got out of hand. There were hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of new species. And what he did is he went through specifically ichthyosaurs, the sort of swimming dinosaurs they're called, or they're not really dinosaurs, sort of swimming marine reptiles. He went through them all and said, hang on a minute, that's got arthritis, that one's just a baby, that one's slightly fat, that one's got this bone disease, that one's just so on and so forth. And he actually condensed several hundred down to just 40 different species. And they're all shown to be the same thing. It's the fact that they had just tiny little anomalies. So that's another thing you also have to be wary of. It's the bias that scientists will come to, because it is describe a new species, you can have it named after you even. There's a lot of money and fame that comes with it as well.
Well, nobody remembers, the 10th guy who found a T-Rex fossil. They only remember the first guy. So everybody wants to, any little variation, they want to hopefully identify it as a new species. I will say this real quick, George. I'll say this and then I'll yield the mic for a bit, because I could probably sum up 20 questions that have come into this one question as to what are your thoughts, Joe, of the whole dinosaur to bird idea, and more specifically, the claim that dinosaurs have feathers. Is there any validity to these ideas and claims?
Okay, so sort of a two-part question. Let's deal with the dinosaurs to birds. First of all, again, biblical perspective. Again, there's another whole presentation. We'll have to do this again sometime, because we've got so many things we could say about it. But dinosaurs to bird, biblical perspective. Dinosaurs, by their very definition, are land animals. They walk on the land, and they have legs that go straight down underneath them. Therefore, according to the Bible, they were created on day 6 of creation. Birds, by definition, fly. Therefore, or at least are sort of aerial birds, aerial creatures. Therefore, by definition, they were created on day 5 of creation. So created on separate days according to the Bible. So again, make sure your Bible is your authority, make sure the Word of God is your authority, and take a biblical perspective on it. So according to the Bible, no, absolutely, birds are not did not evolve from dinosaurs. Okay, now look at a scientific perspective. Again, there's been no such thing as there have not been any specific undisputed transitional forms found. We can deal with Archaeopteryx, for instance. It's completely a bird. That was proved by the Natural History Museum in London a few years back when they actually took its brain out and studied its brain. Because the argument was, well, it's a bird that's halfway between a dinosaur and a bird because it has feathers, but it also has teeth and it has claws on its wings and so on and so forth. Well, none of those are unusual. We have birds with all of them today. It's just all condensed into one with Archaeopteryx. But what they did is they actually extracted its brain out of the fossil itself and ended up basically showing this is a bird's brain. There's no doubt about it. But there's a lot more to creating a feather than just or creating a bird than just sticking feathers on it, right? You have to redesign the entire thing. So you start off with a dinosaur, which is a reptile, which is cold-blooded. I worked as a zookeeper for 6 years. It was a nightmare keeping our animals warm because, well, I worked primarily as a reptile zookeeper. They require a lot of heat, right? So you've got to turn a cold-blooded animal into a warm-blooded animal that actually has got a way of getting enough oxygen around and producing its own heat so that the blood can keep flowing in order to get oxygen enough while it so it can actually fly. Then you need a breathing system, because our breathing system is no good. A reptile's breathing system is even worse. So you've actually got to get a breathing system which injects oxygen into the bloodstream, both on the intake of air and on the outtake of air. So they have a special sort of double-barreled lung system. We breathe in, and the oxygen goes to the blood. We breathe out, and we get rid of oxygen, and then we breathe in again, and so on and so forth. Whereas the double barrel system in the bird's lungs is constantly delivering oxygen into the bloodstream. So very, very clever. Then you need to get rid of the brain, get rid of a reptile's brain, replace it with a bird's brain, which is a phenomenal thing. So in other words, in order to turn a reptile like a dinosaur into a bird, you need to have an incredible amount of new information implanted. Now, one thing we've never seen is any kind of mutations creating new information. They can delete information, they can change around information that's already there. Vast majority of that actually destroys a creature, but they cannot make new information. That comes back onto the question of, well, what is a design? And how would you recognize whether something was designed? Now, the very definition of design is if an object or a design or something has got properties which do not come from the original material source, then that thing has been designed. So a very easy example is an aeroplane. What is an aeroplane? It's a 100% flying object made out of 100% non-flying parts. Each constituent material does not have the inherent property of flight. However, the end product, the plane, has got properties that do not come from the material parts, therefore it's been designed, right? What is a car? A car is a 100% moving object made out of 100% non-moving parts. What is a computer code? Well, a computer code is ones and noughts, right? By themselves, they have no inherent information. They certainly don't make a computer code unless somebody who is cleverer than the computer code, who existed before the computer code, and is far smarter than the computer code, actually made those ones and noughts do what those ones and noughts do not do by themselves. You design a computer code, right? The end product, the code, has properties which do not exist in the materials that it is actually made of. All right, well, what is the inside, what would majorly need to change in order to turn dinosaurs into birds? Answer, their DNA. Well, what is DNA? It's sugars, phosphates, carbons, and nitrogens. Each one of those things you probably ate for your breakfast, right? On their own, they do not have the inherent property of DNA. They're just, on their own, they just don't code for anything. However, DNA is perhaps the most complex coding system that we have ever come across, ever. It comes nowhere. Our computer codes and our systems come nowhere close to DNA in terms of condensing the information, the amount of information. Yet DNA can also repair itself, and DNA can also replicate itself. The end product has properties which do not come from the original source, therefore DNA is designed by definition. By the way, DNA is actually designed to not evolve, because the driving factor of evolution is supposedly mutations, and then natural selection gets rid of the bad mutations and leaves the good ones, right? But inside every single one of your cells, including inside every single living organism, your DNA has a special property which means it corrects mutations. Now, we live in a fallen world, so it doesn't always work brilliantly, but the reality is your DNA is designed to not evolve. So you've got yourself a major problem if you want to argue that evolution is actually the way forward. So there are just so many problems with biologically with dinosaurs evolving into birds. So let's briefly deal with the fossils. More specifically, let's deal with the argument that, or the idea that we found dinosaurs with feathers. Now, some of them have been completely disputed. They are either 100% birds. Some of them have been disputed in the sense that they've been shown to be collagen fibers, and some of them do look very much like feathers and dinosaurs. Now, there's an old sort of creationist, I don't know what you call it, paradox or whatever, where they've gone by definition, only birds have feathers. Therefore, if we find a dinosaur with feathers on it, it must be a 100% bird. Now, that's a circular line of reasoning, and I admit that, right? And there are many creationists out there who look at fossils of dinosaurs with supposed feathers on them, and they say, oh, look, they've got feathers. Does that mean they believe they evolved from, they're evolving into birds? No, it doesn't. Does the presence of feathers in dinosaurs mean that dinosaurs are on their way to evolving into birds? No, it doesn't. Again, going back to the design point, going back to the DNA, going back to the major problems that there are with evolving. However, personally, I have yet to be convinced of any of the supposed feathers on dinosaurs. We have found many feathers in the fossil record. They are beautiful and brilliantly preserved and abundant as well. In every single case of the dinosaurs, they are very, very badly preserved, and there are 100 different other explanations for what they could actually be. Now, it's a controversial topic for creationists as regards to whether or not these are actually feathers or not. I'm of the opinion that they're not. I may well be convinced otherwise in the future as we do more research, but I think that there hasn't been enough research even on the evolutionists' part yet to actually determine whether they are feathers or not. But regardless of it, even if they do turn out to be feathers, and definitely feathers, which I'm skeptical about at the moment, but even if they do, does it prove that dinosaurs are evolving into birds? No, because you still need a mechanism for actually how they evolve. And that's something which has been disproven over and over again. Plus the biblical point that we know, according to the Bible, birds were created a day before dinosaurs anyway. So there's another problem for you, especially theistic evolutionists, to get your head around. Again, why are you calling God a liar?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Look, I'm just aware of the fact that we're almost nearly into 2 hours, and you must be getting exhausted, mate.
It's heading towards midnight here where we are in the UK. So
yeah. I've just got one question before we get to some super chat questions, and we'll finalize the presentation. With birds, there's also the navigation part. How do you evolve? But what are your thoughts on the select few so-called transitional fossils the proponents of evolution point to? I'm referring to Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, and the mammal-like reptiles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the mammal-like reptiles are interesting, as are many of the other transitional fossils. Again, what we've not found is a creature. It depends on what your definition of a transitional fossil is at the end of the day. If you already believe in evolution, then you're going to believe that such things can exist, and so you're going to look for evidence of them. If you believe in creation, then you believe that God designed creatures with a certain amount of diversity, a limited diversity, but they're going to be able to diverse into that. What we haven't found is a creature which is specifically halfway to evolving into a different creature. So Tiktaalik is supposedly a fish on the way to evolving legs, right? It's not. We found fish similar to them alive today. Coelacanth is a classic example, but it's just a very special design type of fin. We haven't found a fish that has got legs sticking out and it's able to breathe on the air, or so on and so forth, right? Archaeopteryx, as I say, has been shown to be a bird by the brain. It's 100% bird-brained, quite literally. So there's no difference there. And again, we've got birds alive today which have got teeth and claws in the wings. We haven't got them together necessarily, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist in the past. The real problem with all of this goes back to really what is your how are these creatures actually going to evolve, or how did they evolve? Because again, going back to the point that I made with design, by definition, DNA and everything inside it is not only designed, but it's also designed to not evolve. So you've got to get past that issue as well. So again, I mean, transitional fossils is again another topic you could go on for hours and hours about, but it really comes down to ultimately this whole thing, this whole issue comes down to who is your authority. If your authority is the fallible word of man, then you're going to be willing to chop and change your opinions and investigations to suit your preconceived ideas, which are preconceived, by the way, on the idea that God doesn't exist. If your authority is the word of God, or at least if you claim it is, then you need to take him as his word that what he said was actually true. Because one thing you'll find is that there are many ideas, theories, opinions, hypotheses that contradict every single part of the Bible, but the facts never actually do.
Okay, great response, Indiana Joe. Yeah, we're going to end it with this one because you have been so generous with your time. This has been amazing. I'll say people are loving you. We've got about 10,000 questions. So what we'll do is I'm going to save all the questions, guys, and for the day that we can have Joe on again, because it's been so awesome and you are an encyclopedia of information. So God bless you. You have been such a huge help. This
one's good
to
do a special Q&A session, just a presentation, just a special Q&A session. That'd be good.
Awesome. That would be an honor. We would be more than happy. You're such a blessing. So, God bless you for that. This one came in the form of a super chat. So they're paying a little bit of money to ask the question. So what we'll do is we'll end it with this last one and we'll call it a night, guys. 2 hours has flown by. This has been so fun. Question is from Sigifredo Sarabia. Hope I said that right. Thank you for the super chat. If global flood, why one Grand Canyon versus other regions? So in other words, why not many Grand Canyons?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are.
Okay, very, very briefly. First of all, you got to get, because this is something I got confused about growing up. We believe that the Grand Canyon layers, the rock layers, were formed by Noah's flood. By the way, the rock layers extend way beyond the Grand Canyon. They go all over the USA. The similar layers are all around the world, right? There's sort of debate between creationists whether it was the retreating flood water or whether it was burst ice banks or whatever carving out the Grand Canyon. But the reality is it's all connected with Noah's flood, and it's greatly affected the way that the Earth's morphology and the way that the Earth's shape actually looks. Now, Grand Canyons, yes, there is Grand Canyon, but the Grand Canyon in the USA is not the largest canyon on planet Earth. There's many, many others. I mentioned one brief canyon in the Blue Mountains in Oz, the Great Big Valley. You can find, I'm not sure whether it's the same size as the Grand Canyon or not, but it's certainly absolutely massive. And you'll find there are canyons all over the world, and they all were carved out by water, and it was all very, very, very quick. You can see that everywhere. Even in the UK, we have much smaller canyons, but you can see how retreating floodwaters and burst ice banks and stuff has carved out the surface of the Earth. So again, it comes back down to that. You can find, again, if you go to creationresearch.net and click on the Q&A, you'll find a whole host of geology information and stuff that you can find there. But there are plenty of canyons all over the world, and they all have wonderful evidence of Noah's flood.
And Joseph, there's also a canyon on Mars, which is much, much bigger than the one on Earth. And there's very little water there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was awesome. Great answer. Great way to end it. Thanks so much for the support. Everybody's saying great stream, great presentation. So, and it's all because you were generous enough with your time, Joseph. So I appreciate it. Thank you, George. This was so rewatchable. Joe, any last words before we shut it down for the night?
Oh, you were great, Joseph. Thank you very much. God bless you, mate, and keep safe.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're sort of in the middle of another lockdown here. Couple of reminders. Number one, make sure that the authority is the word of God, and don't call him a liar, and do not add to his words either. That's a Bible verse from the Psalms. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. And remember, when it comes to geology and fossils, nothing to do with time, everything to do with process.
Amen. Well said. Well said. Great way to end it. So God bless you, and God bless everybody in the chat.
God bless.
God bless you, Joe.